a really exciting area that's both old and new, like everything that we're interested in. And it's called artificial life. And so we'll just kind of jump into this. This is an image I found from this thing called Rattenberg Machine. And so this Italian cyberneticist called Valentino, he had this artwork in there. And I like this sort of mechanical life forms wandering around the moon or something like that. So as usual, I like to start at the beginning. And there's actually a whole wiki just on the history of artificial life. Right? It's really, I'm surprised at how rich the encyclopedia references were on these areas. And so we have this famous mechanical duck here from about 300 years ago. And this isn't exactly how it worked. This was later another American artist who drew what they thought it might do. But we had some very famous automaton in the 18th century. And here we have one that can play the flute, and here one that's playing drums. And this one was a little bird. And you could actually, it was a trick, but you could feed it. And then this thing would actually, make a mess out the other end. It would have, food coloring and breadcrumbs that would come out. People would be like, what is this? So let's jump ahead now to sort of the recent past. In the 90s, we had this thing that came out of Japan called a Tamagotchi. And I remember these were just the viral toy in the mid-90s. And they've actually come back around. The company has re-released this recently, and they're really selling a whole bunch of these. And it was really kind of silly because it was this first it was sort of not even a game, but it was a little digital life form. And you started this thing, and when you opened up this little toy out of the box, it was a little animation of a little creature as an egg, and then eventually it would hatch and it would grow up. And you would have to take care of this thing. You would have to feed it, and it was a virtual pet. And so I've been thinking more about this idea of virtual pet. I think it's something we need to mix in with AI to bring sort of the internal goals that agents have. They have hunger and thirst and boredom and things like that, so we want to see. So I found this comic actually that's this XKCD, at least it looks like it, and it says their hobby is running a massive distributed Tamagotchi pair of universe and keeping them all happy. And so that's kind of what we're gonna try to do, is how can we use these supercomputers to create N+1 life forms, and what would it mean to keep them happy, and so on. So it's really neat. There's this artificial life. There's really 3 different kinds. There's looking at the hardware, which is kind of like what Matt's doing, contraptions that act like they're alive. There's some biochemistry stuff. We'll look later at some simulations of some biochemistry. And then there's software. And how do we think of pieces of software as something like living systems? And so this field was founded by Christopher Langton, or at least coined the name. He put together the first conference for this as recent as '87. He has this thing called the Langton ant. And it's really a generalization of kind of like the Turing machine and the cellular automata. And so it's not designed to model biological ants in a direct sense, but it's this little critter that's going to move around a world that's very, very simple, just these different colored squares, and then it's going to have a very simple rule about when it encounters a square, what does it do? And it turns out it's equivalent to a Turing machine, which is really fascinating. That means theoretically, we could set up any computer problem we wanted to have answered, and we could let this ant march around in 2D. It might take 10,000 years, but eventually it will solve that problem for us. So there's also this idea of a digital organism. I was surprised this is a separate wiki than the artificial life, which is really neat. And on the right here, we have these video games that came out in the 80s. There's 2 of them of interest. One of them is called Sim Life, and the other one's called Sim Earth. And these are sort of the predecessors to The Sims that are very popular now, and or at least they were very popular. And what you could do with this is you could actually create little life forms, and you could have sort of a mix and match. This is a casino style, swap where you could, change out the different patterns with the pull of a random thing. And so it's just really neat software. I grew up playing some of these titles, and I'm kind of almost frustrated that the math world isn't here yet. That we got to go back to the 80s to find these simulations that are really this sophisticated. I think we need to start running these things not just for fun, but for real scientific purposes. And I'd encourage everybody to go and look at the user manual of these 2. I posted them online. They're really extraordinary. I mean, they talk about artificial life, right, in the very first part. It's really interesting. So I like the Sim Earth really takes an interesting idea of the living planet, really this sort of Gaia hypothesis, that we can, one perspective is to look at the planet itself as undergoing an evolutionary process, and even a developmental process. And so I've been thinking about, what would it mean to sort of build a digital world or a digital universe? So here's what that Sim Earth looks like in the 80s. You can see it's a cellular automata, so it's not that much farther along from the von Neumann stuff that we'll look at in a second, but it's got these cool retro graphics. But nowadays with our modern computer, we can run this at a very, very high speed. when people ran this as a home game, it taxed their computer to the max. And so it was really, you were really kind of pushing the limits of what you could simulate. But nowadays we can run this very high speed and in parallel. Exactly. So we want to think about, we're going to look at the next is this idea of an artificial plant, and this came out in 1956 in Scientific American. And they have this little diagram here of logic and control, and chemical processing and power, and then it says manufacturing and assembly. One of the interesting about fish is they make more fish. So where does all this stuff, how do we bootstrap this from the beginning, and what would it look like to do that digitally? So I was really shocked putting together some of these slides of how far back these ideas go. So in 56, Moore proposed these artificial living plants, which was really, really way ahead of its time. And these things would go out and they would sort of live at the edge of the ocean, and they would collect raw resources and turn them into things that people need. And so here was kind of a sketch of this thing. It's kind of hard to parse this at first, but here's sort of like a big raft. They're saying this is an artificial living plant, jet propelled on the model of a squid. And so here, plant, it's almost confusing. Does he mean like a plant in the sense of a factory type plant, or does he mean like a tree plant? I think he's deliberately trying to kind of blur the lines between those two. Here we have on the other side of this big floating contraption what looks like a mechanistic factory with claws and things like this. And then it says when securely moored, it would begin the process of reproduction. And you see some seagulls here on the seashore and all this. So I think this is an incredibly far-sighted view for 1956 about a machine that would harvest resources from its environment and be able to make copies of itself. This is like when we go out for a nature walk on campus. This is what we encounter all the time. So how is it we can go in and take ideas from these systems and try to figure out how to build these artificial ones? And so here it says, like Lemmings, a school of artificial living plants swims into the harvesting factory. And so it's going to sort of, at one point, you can collect these things automatically, and they can bring their parts that they've built to some central location. So that was very ahead of its time. And so how do we get to that? Nature regulates itself, right? There's no conductor for springtime or anything like that. So how does this kind of thing synchronize and organize itself such that all this happens in a coordinated way? So I wanted to kind of make this interactive. So I'm glad we're doing this format. So I want to take a couple minutes now and have you guys kind of brainstorm. We don't brainstorm together about some big ideas. Now we kind of have a brief teaser about what I'm talking about a lot on the show. But I wanted to kind of, before I show you all that stuff, what would we want out of artificial life? What would we want out of artificial plants? And so maybe we can whiteboard for a second, put some ideas down. I'm still trying to figure out our format here. So. But I don't want this to just my ideas. I want to know what you guys. Yeah. Okay, here. Let's see you later.
Get that whiteboard behind here, maybe?
Yeah.
It's on camera.
Alright, you got some ideas for our artificial life form? Who would want to build a life form? What would we do with it?
We want to generate
You want to generate an idea? Okay, so we need like an idea block or something, right? So you want thinking. So you want life that thinks, right? Something that makes ideas. So let's see. You want it to generate ideas. So it could be sort of like an idea factory, right? So you could have like these little plants are thinking all the time, and then they show up at one point and we have new ideas. Right? What else is something they would want them to manufacture or do?
That's what hypothesis.
What's some artificial scientists?
Because every idea was launched into the, obviously, from the practical.
We wanted to create a picture more specific.
Okay, so we want a
That might be a sort of barometer for the quality of the ability to do both of those two things.
So some kind of prediction engine.
Yeah, I think that's that sort of.
It's a test.
And we would want something that tests different evolutionary principles.
Test principles, yeah.
Been like interested in evolution in context of well, no, within the system itself.
So to test evolution and development ideas, right?
I mean, a life is going to be generating a sort of success or failure within the game based on evolutionary algorithms.
So Rachel, we're putting down ideas about what we would want our life to do or to be, kind of think creatively about.
I was say.
So this is prediction
Yeah, so
engine,
I can hear about that.
artificial science.
That's all I know. I just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just says time.
That was a
Right,
time
right.
the idea generated that it would treat each idea like a hypothesis and go test it automatically. So the artificial science.
If they were smart enough to even want to test something like we're saying.
Predicting the future is good, but shouldn't it also, beyond our ability to access to the information?
Okay, so you want something.
A large foundation of science and real-time access to it.
Okay, so this is
Yeah.
Matt saying he wants something that maps history.
Unless you know what language.
I was just looking at Linden Systems last night, or something that came up on the wiki. So I think we might want to have a couple things like maybe AI versus AI. And I think that's maybe the big question. The big question is, what's the difference between this pursuit of artificial life versus artificial intelligence? Because something that generates ideas or maps history or something like that, or predicts, that might be in the AI, and maybe like the testing evolution, testing ideas about DNA or other forms of life, maybe non-DNA life, right? Because all the life we have is DNA, right? We don't know of anything that's alive that's not DNA. What else do you think? Take us all. What do you want a life form to be if you make a life form?
I was actually going to say something very similar to the evolution thing, that like to make intentional gene mutations and stuff in like a life environment.
So, like,
and see the
mutations.
result. Just what is the whole nature of natural selection? Okay.
So like mutations, natural selection. So we could look at selection pressures.
One of those things that if we have a life, this is maybe more of an AI than an AI, I think we're quite AI as well. Is how do we educate? How does, I mean, we know how to learn, it's just throw information at it, but I think testing different strategies and providing various foundational information.
You can educate in a developmental fashion.
Right, I mean, the development.
That's it, that's it.
Right, and that's something I really think we need to put some
Not
time
the
into this, because we're gonna have so much ways of doing it, just put it on the machine online, and here's its cost, right?
It makes me think there's this famous example in neuroscience with
There's your genetic algorithm, right?
the sea sponge that has a brain. There's a sea sponge that in its larval form, it's small, miniature, and it floats free form around the ocean. And it has a nervous system, it has a small, simple brain at one phase in its life. And then later, it anchors down and becomes a sea sponge. And because it doesn't move anymore, it no longer needs its brain. And it actually gets rid of it.
Yeah.
It needs it.
Like 10 years.
It says right.
That's
That once you anchor down, you just sit and eat your brain. So it's interesting that maybe something starts as a life and then later like develops an intelligence, but in the beginning it doesn't even have the intelligence.
It gets to the larger issue of what is intelligence, and nowadays, when I see a lot of workshops on kinds of minds and whatnot, and people talk about cognition so broadly, it's almost ridiculous. So, the slime molds that can navigate the Tokyo subway maze,
Do we call that
by
thinking?
very simple algorithmic abilities are called cognitive systems now.
Yeah, so
the
Turing,
whole thing is becoming very blurry in practice.
was it Turing that said something about like we call a submarine swimming kind of thing? Like to think of, he said, I think somebody said it, to say if a machine is thinking is like asking if a submarine swims.
But
It's not, what do we mean by swimming?
It's like Chomsky's grammar. You can find classes of problems, and you can say, if you can solve one of these, you can solve all of these. It's going to be isomorphic in the sense that the other similar, right? So it really is algebra at a certain level that is rock is in. Now, rocks can also do some definitions, probably stuff you can do.
What's kind of neat to think that, so maybe we could think of like a threshold of some abstract cognition. Maybe it's not what we think of it, maybe some other word. But the life forms have to do something, right? If they're not processing information, like this is the term, they're probably not going to stay alive very long. And can we find an example of a living thing that's not doing some kind of computation, maybe I'd say? So bacteria have to compute their environmental state, their internal state, their external state, ants and termites and so on. So So maybe computation is this thing to be alive. If we go into the biology textbooks, there's this like laundry list of sort of 8 or 9, 10 not very satisfying ideas about what to be alive. It's growth, reproduction, metabolism, and all these kind of things. But maybe it's something that computes. Maybe it's something that.
Indeed, there are theories now out there. Sarah Walker, Paul Davies, they have these information theories of life that allow AIs to satisfy the technical definition, AI programs of life, and that's something that
In a way that's not just a,
very
it's not just like any two. It's sort of motivated.
It's motivated.
It's also like, how do we include AI?
It's,
These are normal criteria people come up with.
yeah, it's hugely motivated. I mean, to the classic problem, right, in the search for life on other planets, so these not aliens now.
That's where the next. Did you know what it was?
I think it was one.
Oh, God, I'd love to. As a geek, not being somebody.
It's a wonderful thing.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. That would be great. But, no, what I was thinking was, see, when NASA, I was the NASA chair up until when I came here, and we want to find life on other planets, and I mean microbial life, I don't mean necessarily, civilizations, although that would really be a hit. That would be
I know what to look for.
But that's the problem. It's actually a philosophical issue, it's an epistemological issue, because if we look using instruments we've developed on Earth or the, indicators of the kind of life we have on Earth, we may in fact miss other forms of life. Even astrobiology textbooks talk about silicon life as a possibility, and they can't rule it out. They think there's a slight probability.
That's kind of what we're building in a sense.
Episode, the Borda,
Oh, yeah.
silicon being. So anyway, A-life is interesting because it can, in fact, together with extremely, computational resources that are improving literally by the second, give us this kind of out-of-the-box thinking about the nature of life.
What might be out there.
Humans, with our intrinsic biases, may not be able to find, sort of in a Wolfram style, take the fundamental laws of the universe and, in your basement, run a computer, and see what forms of life might actually be out there, right? Compatible with the laws of physics, not compatible with our anthropocentric ideas about DNA-based life. So,
Absolutely.
So at a level, you can say, you build the AI, because it's the only one we've been able to hear from the other AI that's out there.
yeah, it may be that the AIs
It'll figure out how to hear it.
compute differently,
It won't be constrained to think where we can look.
Deep learning systems aren't, as we know, completely brain-like. At best, they're a little, very roughly.
We were talking yesterday about
They come up with different ways of thinking.
When Arthur Samuel beat himself in checkers, it's kind of like playing hide and go seek with yourself, right? How do you do it? Any place you would think to hide, you can also think to look. Well, with its other life forms, we don't know where to look because we would never think to hide there.
Right. Create thinking machines to solve problems. And I think that's what DeepMind's been doing lately. Some of the big problems.
I think there's huge potential to bring together these ideas with the deep learning. I haven't really seen it much yet. It's just learning last year, so in terms of people starting to pay attention to it again. That's right. Anybody else have ideas you want to put on here?
We don't have robots on there. Robots. Has anyone seen Elon Musk's robot video?
So this is called hard and life, and this is when you use hardware.
That's right.
Oh.
So
And so there's some interesting stuff there, I think, with analog.
This is very cute video of Elon Musk and the robot. At the end, you did see this fake. It's not good. I don't know that.
It was a person at the city.
No, it was a person in the city. That's
You can tell.
They're breakdancing. That's what you can tell.
Is it a real project they're trying to do though? Or is
I
it-
don't even know.
I saw it reported as a real problem.
I think it's.
But then there was something funny, but this said, Elon Musk was quoted as saying, "It probably won't work." I'm like, that's not,
I think maybe
picture,
it's
that's where's the product picture?
Like everybody forget the fact that my autonomous vehicles are running into emergency trucks.
But what about that? The analog, but I was thinking, so this sort of, you can get massive parallelization from artificial life, you get massive parallelization of possible potential, right? You got these agents that can do stuff and learn at the same time. And so what you've really done is truly parallelize things. But if you're depending on a CPU, if you depend on a CPU all the time, you're not going to parallelize it. It's big.
We're not. Depending on the CPU.
Everyone else is. Right, they probably be like, it's GPUs.
I think, we might all be in a simulation.
I was just saying, the GPUs aren't really, those aren't really powerful.
That would be great. That's what.
There are a bunch of serial computers in parallel.
Is this supposed to
They're
be?
big money power.
But they're serial computers. They're serial computers.
They're all suffering from their shit.
Oh, wow, we can't wait to see it.
These two that come over here, they're.
They're still the bottom, they're still the CPU.
Once they have to figure it out.
Outputs.
It's gonna be a big draw with the students coming into Sandbox.
So
It's
Alan's
gonna
on
be
the-
crazy. If we made them not get the students,
All right, so
yeah.
so now we can kind of think. We're going to think a little bit about. And I was surprised at how some of these ideas go back to exactly what you're talking about, Susan. That I was really surprised how quickly this runs into this old astrophysics type stuff, and I couldn't believe that these ideas have been around as long as they have. And then here's the scientist I'm actually familiar with. He's published together with some of the people in the center. So Kelso and Harmon and stuff. They're in a book that's put together by Michael Grin. So I've seen this guy. His book's here in the library.
How interesting.
And I was shocked that, because I've seen him before, he's computational neuroscience, and I had no idea that he proposed this idea in '74 of sending these automatic spacecraft out. And here's another artist's conception of what something might sort of crash into a crater and then build itself out.
And then
something like that.
There's the famous von Neumann probe.
So so I'm gonna get to that. So, or some of it. So the next thing I found was Freeman Dyson, a friend of yours, and he came up with this amazing idea of sending out these separate self-replicating things, and crazy enough, he called them asteroid chickens. And so next time on Friday, we're gonna be animating some chickens, and we can put them in outer space and stuff like that. So what I found is I found a bunch of kind of pixel resources, video game assets. So, as programmers and coders, we have a GitHub, and we put out very valuable code so the rest of the community can make use of our work. Turns out artists do the same thing, and I found this whole other sort of like a GitHub for artists. We put out these amazing animations and graphics that we can use to build our little artificial universes. And so we can create artificial planets, and we can create artificial backdrops. And what's really neat is these are really generated by random numbers. And so you can create as many little different planets, and they're all completely unique. And then we can start to think of, well, what would live on that planet? What would the properties be there? Just as an abstract kind of goal of starting to think about what these things would be. He coined this idea, this asteroid chicken. He said it'd be unlike anything before. It'd be sort of a mixture of biology and AI and organic components. And you sort of launch this thing out into space, and then once it can collect enough energy, it's a pretty wild idea. Now what we can do is with the AI, we can generate, these are all three randomly generated backdrops. We can control if we want stars or planets or whatever it is you want there. And then up here we have three randomly created organisms. So they just has a sort of a blueprint that makes a sort of something that looks like it has a body plan. And so now we can have an artificial life and these really artificial critters, and they each kind of get their own look, and they can live in their own little world. And we can really try to build these digital universes. And so it's just really neat. You can just generate endless numbers of these planets, and they all look slightly different. So it's neat to where this all comes from. Here we're back in 53, von Neumann sort of authorizing this new project, and this was really fascinating. This was a guy named Niles Baricelli, and he wanted to design a series of numerical experiments with the possibility of evolution similar to that of living organisms in an artificially created universe. Right? So that's what we're looking at, is how do we create an artificial universe, and then we can put our organism in it. And so I love this experiments in bionumeric evolution, electronic computer. Let's see, in 1953 here, right? Can you believe it? So I think we're sort of, to realize that the very first computers ever were for these ideas. This isn't tacked on at the end later, now that computers are 75 years on board with them. No, this is why you built computers. And it wasn't to check Facebook and such, it was to think about ideas like this.
Well, I'm sorry, can you clarify, did they actually do the experiment?
Yeah.
Or was it just, oh,
No,
okay.
they ran these, yeah, I have some of the pictures of it.
Okay.
And so this was like the proposal to get it off the ground. They had done some of them by hand first, and then he was basically at University of Onslow, and then he was basically being invited over, pitching this to the institute, saying, can I come run these on your computer? And so they wanted to test this idea of numerical genes and evolutionary organisms and the reproduction and mutation rules. And so it's just so neat. You see here the universe is a linear array of n locations, a lot like the WISC computer we were looking at. Sorry, this keyboard is sticky, so it goes too fast. Okay, so the idea was to find analogies or possible essential descriptions or discrepancies rather between the bionumerical and the biological phenomena. And so just overall to test this idea of evolution and reproduction, I think it's neat they use the word norms. That's kind of like we would use loss functions, but that's really what a norm does.
Please, I'm sure what's the second name?
Second name? Oh, the second name, I'm sorry. To observe how evolution in numeric organisms takes place by hereditary changes and selection to verify whether some of the organisms are able to speed up their evolution by gene replacements or by acquiring new genes by any other primitive form of sexual reproduction. And so really they're thinking about the evolution of evolvability, in a sense, already.
This is a very sophisticated question I'm already asking. It's not just like, hey, let's
Can it evolve? They're saying, can its ability to evolve evolve? So this observed evolutionary process, they did this, were executed manually, so it's interesting to see. Some of these experiments with numeric organisms are executed manually. How slow that would be. The game of life was actually done with paper and pencil first. And they wanted to look at the hereditary changes, the transfer of hereditary characteristics in these numeric organisms. So I just love these ideas. And then already they were talking about biological analogies such as the emergence of parasitism and things like that. So it's just very advanced biological theory in this very early kind of thing.
Do we know what the actual machine was? What
It was the Institute for Advanced Study. It was their
were they planning? I mean, what kind of?
What did the machine look like? Yeah, let's pull it up. So they talk about like a V6 in your car. This was a V20, and it had the Williams tube. So here we see John von Neumann and Oppenheimer, and here we see what are called Williams tubes. And so these were developed out of radar screens, and they're cathode ray tubes. So they're evolution of the vacuum tube technology, and there's a phosphorus, and this is how televisions and radar screens worked. And what they realized is they could paint a dot onto the screen of that memory, and then that dot would fade there. Remember when you used to turn off the TV, there was a few seconds when the light was still there. And so what they would do is they would use that persistence on the screen as the memory itself. The electron beam would then get back to the memory dot. If there was a dot there, they would recharge it, brighten it up again. We have a flashlight version of this I brought in. And then it would recharge that, and then that would be the memory. And so this was the V20, had these things sort of lined up in this V configuration like an engine. And this was one of the first, stored program computers running in the world.
And that's at the IAS?
Yeah.
I wonder if it's still there.
I've seen
Maybe we
it.
could try to find it.
Yeah, we should. It's in a.
I'm a member there.
Yeah, I bet they have. They have to have it. If not, it's going to be in one of the computing museums. But I bet they still have a lot of things. You know who would know was George.
George used to,
George would know.
he's saying as a kid, he'd find all kinds of stuff like really important to the history of computing. This is George Dyson, Freeman's son, in like barns on the property.
I'll pull up after I had
just kind of sitting there collecting dust.
There's a really good von Neumann documentary I can show you that has this on there.
Oh, wow.
Excellent.
I'm fascinated by all that.
Oh, I know, that was just so interesting. Okay, so in '49, von Neumann put out this lecture series, and he was saying he was really trying to find this threshold of complexity. What's the minimum system we need such that it can start to do these things we're interested in, like grow, evolve, and do its own thing. I was really shocked at how progressive and ahead of its time von Neumann's ideas were. So he proposed these cellular automata things. Don't worry about the details of this. We'll talk about this in another talk. But what's interesting is he has this idea that the process of construction from a description parallels DNA translation. The passive process of copying the description parallels DNA replication. The inheritance of mutated description parallels vertical inheritance of DNA mutations. And all of these were proposed by von Neumann before the discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule. So I just think that's a really extraordinary example of mathematical and theoretical science really driving science.
Wait, which paper was it? Which paper is that from?
I'm pretty sure it's from this 49 stuff.
Threshold of self-increasing
There's an
systems.
alien landed here, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the Martians, right? So you wonder where the Martians came from. And so here we have we can run this and animate in another program after the talk, but this is a cellular automata that's running, it's the John von Neumann's rules. And here we have a sort of genetic code that's stored on a Turing tape-like tape here. And then we have his abstract copying apparatus. And amazingly, what this machine will do is it will read a description of itself. Right? This is some brutal stuff. It's going to read a description of itself off the tape and then use its machinery to make a copy of itself. And so this is a sort of a mathematical pattern that can duplicate itself. What's really interesting is we can add mutations to this, right? So here we have this self-replicating machine. If we add the instructions to make it print out this flower, it will then further do that, and that will get carried along with replications. So we already have sort of a mathematical thing that can evolve and carry on mutations. It's interesting to see some of these characters that we see a lot of times in neuroscience and other places. And it was just really interesting here to think about that we have both the computer code and the machine that's running the code. And I think that's what's interesting about this artificial life, is it forces us to think about the universe itself. What is this physics that's running the code, right? Like DNA by itself won't do anything. We have to put DNA in our physical universe, inside of a cell and everything else, and then it will do stuff. So this idea that it's not the function itself, it's just a description of it, I think is kind of interesting. Turing said that being digital should be more interesting than being electronic. So it's not. It happens to be that we can simulate these things very quickly on an electronic computer, but it doesn't really have anything to do with electricity. We're not really using electricity itself.
Yeah.
I think, like Elon was saying earlier, the analog computers really use electricity. They don't just use electricity to hold symbols. They're thinking with electricity. Here we have an actual plant, sort of the palisade layer, a cross section of a thin piece of plant here. So maybe that's something we'd want to model as a life form. And here we have an artificial pattern. This is called a multi-scale Turing pattern. I don't know if anybody's ever seen these. These are really,
It's beautiful.
isn't it? Let's see if we can see this live.
They need some Sandbox art.
I know, we'll have to put this like on the TV
That
running.
looks like an Aborigine painting.
Isn't it wild? And so where do these kind of, where do their ideas come from, right? When an Aboriginal puts this onto the cave wall, is there a Turing pattern generator in their mind that's allowing this to happen? In some sense, there has to be, right? And so we can see this and get all kinds of really interesting patterns and randomize this, but we get very biological structures. And so this multi-scale kind of effect very much looks like the kind of stuff we're going to see when we get our microscope set up. So if we compare and contrast that with like our actual plant, not designed to act like a plant, it just happens to look like one. So there's a real plant, there's a fake one. So these are just these really interesting patterns. We have a forest that looks like this. How do we ultimately want to get to something photorealistic? But we're going to start with something much simpler. We have a whole lot of complexity. How do structures like this emerge? When we think of evolving something like a spider web, it almost seems like impossible that that sort of thing would just come out of nowhere. But I think that's what these artificial life forms can help us understand. It's how do we make those big, and sometimes they call punctuated evolution, where you get these big, massive jumps like the Cambrian explosion, or suddenly feet show up or something, and then almost everything decides that feet are a good idea, and it should happen. As complex systems, we like to look at the interactions between these natural systems and human systems. It's hard to do it down here in Florida, but up north, when they build a new campus, they don't put the sidewalks out, they wait till it snows. And then what you do is you see where people make the path. And that's where people are going to walk anyway. And then you put paths there. And so it's a really brilliant algorithm to figure out where we should build brick-way paths. People cut the grass anyway. So you just wait till it snows, find out the paths that people naturally want to take between buildings, and then you get that pattern. So we can do the same kind of a thing with ants. We can look at the simulations. We can set up these little ants and give them a little food and have them run around, make these little trails. What's really neat, the ants, they know that the world is really complicated. So if you imagine like in the deep ocean, in the big 3D space of the world, there's really not much life. Life doesn't really like 3D. It's too big, it's too empty, it's too lonely. Nature likes 2D, and it even prefers one-dimensional. So what I mean is, nature likes coral reefs, they like oasis, they like the they like the shelf, the continental shelf, they like the Gulf Stream. They like a border, a boundary, because then you can organize and actually collect. And we can test these ideas with randomly walking agents. And if we make two agents and we put them in 3D, and we just have them randomly move around in 3D, we say, what's the likelihood they'll bump into each other? It's like very, very unlikely. They will never just by chance meet anyone in 3D. And so animals know this. They like stay on the ground, or they'll go to a little lake or something where it's all sort of one spot, where the animals will stay at the surface. Ants do one even better. They don't want to vine, where it's one dimensional. There's one way in and one way out. and all of the ants can live on this one-dimensional world because it's much simpler. They can't possibly get lost. They can't leave their world because there's only one way into their world and only one way out of their world. Interesting that they find these low-dimensional manifolds and they create their life around that. So, how do they do these kind of goals? Ants individually do not have the cognitive capacity to think of abstract goals and problem solve, but somehow the system itself, the collection of ants, operates more like a brain and can do that.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So you know all about ants. If you just had one ant, you separated it from the rest of the ants, would it die? Like bees?
Yeah,
So
it'll eventually.
Really can't survive.
Well, what's actually interesting? I was just actually reading about this in the sense that the ants in general, they're very limited in their behavioral responses, in a sense. And so when they're in the nest, they've encountered all the scenarios, they sort of have a known response. When they're by themselves, I was just reading, they basically not just get lost, but they don't know what to do, right? They no longer get enough feedback clues from their other agents to even choose the right behavior.
Sort of watch an ant that's lost. What it's clearly trying to do,
Just find
get unlocked.
Get unlocked, right?
And it's just, just sort of
It's a faster
probably optimal.
It's they usually want to go a faster way.
Yeah, that's another mode. Their mode is lost. So there's two stages. Right. And
I think what you just said even is true about things that can live in a 3D space, but choose to live in a 2D.
Oh, yeah, that's what I mean, yeah.
See, like bats,
Yeah.
how they fly, they just ignore the Z-axis. They don't go up and down. They just like go like this and then repeat the same.
Really?
But they keep like on a.
Like when they're exploring
Awesome
for
level.
fruit or something, they look up and down for fruit.
I've seen bats like backing around in the south, and that's what they do. I don't know why. You don't see them go up and down, and they just.
It could be that
stay
the bugs
the
are
same
at that
level.
level too. But then you gotta wonder why the bugs are at that level.
Don't want like more dimensions, I guess.
Yeah, because you'll just get lost. You'll just get lost. So, like in the big block, I used to do some deep sea fishing, and one point it was just way out in the middle of nowhere. We used to go to where like the Gulf Stream is. At one point we were just out in the middle of nowhere on the way back. And I jump in, and it's 500 feet deep. You put the goggles on, and it's frightening because there's nothing. There's nothing as far as you can see. You can't see a ball, but you can see as far as you can imagine in every direction. There's nothing, not one single fish, not one, because there's nothing there. Right? They have to find the sea vents, the whale fall, a coral reef, something like that. It's really interesting, these sort of megastructures that are built by termites. These things can get really, really tall. You can see here's the meter scale. They actually will align these things with the sort of northwest, east, south, east, west, north, south, depending on where they are, and it actually acts like an air conditioning system. So there's a passive, there's buildings now that are trying to do the biomimicry of this, but you get hot air will actually wick, and this thing will actually bring in fresh, cool air as the hot air rises. So it has a sort of a passive air conditioning system that these termites can do. And so we can run these very simple organisms. I'm really excited about, say 100 years from now or so, little something we might call robots, we might call artificial life forms, we might miniaturize wallies. They can go and they'll choke the landfill, and they'll separate it into pieces. They'll say, here's a pile of platinum, and here's a pile of gold, and here's a pile of silver, and nickel, and tin, and everything else you can imagine. The proportions, the stuff you need in approximately the right proportions to build a society are in a landfill. In a weird sort of way. But we don't have the resources to kind of separate them, but these little things can do that. The way the ants in my backyard recycle mangoes is just extraordinary. Right? It'll be like one little mango, and then one makes a little hole, and then you come in and it's like hollow, and you eat the whole thing. Happy it's gonna be. So how does all this work? How does nature coordinate all this activity? In '92, there was a guy named Craig Reynolds. He came up with this voids model. I like to joke and imagine that it's like a New York accent, like it's a bunch of voids. I don't know if that's actually the case. And then here we can see sort of very early crude simulations of this. They use this in a lot of video games, everything from Lion King to Batman. They use this algorithm to simulate the birds and penguins. So we can get this free art, like I was saying. You can find all this really adorable clip art, kind of pixel art, and they have animated versions of it, so we can make little birds. We can make little birds. We can make them fly around. We can kind of give them patterns and see what does this look like. Kind of almost looks like a big brain, right? How do bees do their thing? It's really quite extraordinary. Some interesting stuff about the Japanese honeybee versus the European honeybee and how they respond to the hornet wasp. Have you guys seen that? It's really wild. There's a big giant wasp that eats honeybees, and it's from Asia. So the Japanese honeybees are aware of this, and they have an evolutionary response that when this wasp comes it's able to all of the bees attack at once. And they actually buzz this thing and they raise the internal temperature like 1 or 2 degrees and actually cook this wasp. The European bees do not have the evolutionary, they didn't encounter this wasp in an evolutionary time scale, they have no adaptation to it. And so when the wasp comes up to the thing, the poor European bees get slaughtered like one at a time because they attack it like single file. Like, I'll get them, and the next guy's like, oh, my turn now. And it's just like, the poor soldiers, just one after the other, just absolutely get clobbered. And then they wipe out the whole colony in 15 minutes. But the other bees have evolved to deal with that kind of strategy. It looks like Terminator. So, even these sea turtles, they don't like the open ocean. They like and how do they get back to the same spot? I mean, that's really good. So we gotta sit down with it. I don't think you've been yet. You go to Limbo?
Oh, I can't wait to.
We have an extraordinary resource just on the beach here, and they raise these sea turtles. Apparently, it's one of the only places in the world where they bring these turtles back.
That's what's raising them is when they're injured.
Right, rehabilitating. Right.
What are tons of bees?
But
We have like a whole.
their purpose, there is a.
Oh my God, I'm so there.
Go on turtle walks at 11:30 at night and see them hatching.
Yeah.
Back to
Why they like
there's
to
a
get
point
the
that
test
they go to the
protected?
beach and they'll take care
Oh,
of the sea
I
bass.
really want to do that. Yeah, I love that.
I think they do like the disturbed nests and stuff like that. If they think the nest is like in the wrong location and stuff like that. This was really neat. This is something I found from '92. This one's called Polyworld, and these are little organisms that had random genomes. I actually found a book of this. I just ordered it for the Sandbox. Found an old copy of the same book, so I think it's cool. But where do all these geometric shapes come from? How do these organisms create these shapes, these patterns, and how do they evolve? This is something called a Linden system, which is really kind of wild, and they look very organic, very wild, kind of like these things. And so these are models after plants and animals, and so they're sort of growth models.
What are these called?
They're called Linden systems, L systems as they're called. Just look up L systems. And they're based on substitution rules of like repeating patterns. And so anytime, let's draw one up here. You make a recipe, this is similar to the stuff that Wolfram works on. He's done a lot of great work in this area. What we do is we have a pattern. Let's say the pattern looks like that. And then what we do is we're going to replace every segment with that pattern, right? So it's going to be like a fractal. So let's start here. So I'm going to take that thing, but I'm going to replace it with that. So I'm going to put it like that. And now I'm going to draw that one, but I'm going to replace it with this. So I'll go like that. And then I'll draw that one, but I'm going to replace it with that. So I'll draw like that. And now I'm going to do it again, right? I'll draw another one. So that means this thing's going to go out. And this thing's going to go out. And so we get this sort of like growth type pattern, sort of like a fractal. And depending on what that original shape is, right? If you get like a shape like that, you're going to get very different, kind of shapes that come off this thing.
Do you see the physics book I sent you, Wolfram project?
The new one.
The new one.
Yeah, that's the new one. That's like what he was talking about in his talk.
Yeah.
We should definitely go through that. We'll have to have him.
Oh, he has a new book.
It's about the stuff that he presented on, that glorious space and the.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, book on that?
Oh, we might do that.
Suppose it says me.
Oh,
Yeah, we should read it as well.
Yeah, let's order a copy.
that would be
Let's order a
fun.
copy.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
Work it up. So book them.
So where do all these patterns come from? So Alan Turing actually spent the later part of his research looking at these kinds of patterns here, where they emerge from, what's called morphogenesis. I found this fascinating. I was so shocked by this. This is a mathematical fish if I've ever seen one. Check this out.
Is that a jellyfish?
It's math. This is just an equation. This is like an equation somebody found. We're going to look at this in a second. But this is like a rendering. Sorry, it's so short. It's like a rendering of a mathematical formula, essentially. So it just looks so biological. It's just striking.
And there's physics in it too.
And it's just so much. It's like, wait, that's a fish. I know what fish looks like. So what are these things made out of? Is nature made out of gears? A few hundred years ago, we thought that there was a clockwork universe, and that the mind was modeled after a pocket watch or something like that. And people thought that we could take these kinds of things and use it and say, well, we'll just get a collection of gears and we'll get one 3D printer, and that will print another 3D printer, and that will print another 3D printer. Maybe. It's not impossible. But nature does a pretty good job at 3D printing itself. All you need to do is supply the French fries. So, how can we replicate these massive systems that run on picowatts and can just take over the whole planet and run on CO2 and sunlight and stuff like this? It doesn't really make any sense. So here's another version of that fish. This is a generalized version of the game of life. This is called Lena, and this is a smooth, the Latin word smooth, and this is a different kind of life, but it's like the game of life, and we get these sort of mathematical jellyfish. This is the same pattern we saw a minute ago. And so this is sort of just like a math equation that happens to support entities that look very biological. If I didn't know any better, this was called Lena. And so it's related to larger than life and smooth life. And so it's just a slightly larger neighborhood and a continuous neighborhood, and you get very, very interesting kind of patterns that emerge that, like this one here, it seems like it's a standalone entity. Right? And so the ability to translate, so it's a stable pattern, we might call it a soliton in a sense, because it's like a wave pattern that's going to move along and maintain its shape as it goes.
Just to be clear, these are, what they're doing is implementing rules. They're not defined independently as these agents, oh great, computer graphics,
Exactly.
Here's physics.
So this is a cellular automata. We have a world, we have sort of like the game of life kernel, as we call it, we get a field, and then we can kind of just map this whole out. So there's no discrete components here at all, right? The fact that we see an agent is really a stall in your mind. It's really just this phenomenon of this sort of mathematical wave moving around. But it's interesting, they're showing that how we can get sort of searching through parameters to find new species, essentially, in this space. So there's sort of a new flavor of mathematical biology that I don't think really existed.
It's funny because it seems to me like we're going to amplify this to the point where we're like, oh, the ones that are interesting, the ones that look like life. But
Right. That's a good point. Right, because the other ones are just, they don't look like fish. Show you. So they can do really interesting things, like here they're attracting and then repelling. It's a very interesting phenomenon here. And so at certain times they can sort of split in two and reproduce themselves, and then you get copies of that. We can do this in higher dimensions, so you don't have to simulate these in 2 and 3D, you can simulate these in higher dimensions. So now we're really at this, like we're really building these artificial life forms. It isn't getting wacky stuff because no one knows how to analyze these things. We'd have to go back in the virtual ocean. They really look like jellyfish. This one I thought was really striking. It looks like one of those undersea rovers, they go around, they look at all the crazy jellyfish in the deep sea. And this really feels like a deep sea, exploration. Like, what are these things? Has anyone ever seen them before? So there's one that's sort of reproducing, so we can get.
Actually, an orbit there, it goes in orbit.
Is this reaction diffusion?
Yeah,
Two, it orbits.
We're gonna run these on Friday.
Oh, that's crazy.
The white's in orbit. There it is.
We could literally make an Oculus game based on these images.
Totally.
Like stick someone, like have someone walking in the world, just creatures.
Constantly generating.
So, so what are these aliens? Are these demons? Are these spirits? Are these aliens? What are these things? Right? Where did they come from? Are there, math is as big as we need, so there's going to be a lot of them, right? It's one of these things that we found one, we've found something.
So none of these, though, have kind of reached the true threshold of replication in any real sense, right?
Well, I think we're getting there. Some of those are just those are just math equations that people were looking at that happen to have these properties. Now, this is another model this is a physics engine. And so what we're seeing here is something we might use in a video game that's trying to detail and simulate pieces actually colliding and moving into each other, right? So this is like muck in a petri dish, and it's trying to simulate how stuff run into each other. And then what people are doing with this is extraordinary. I've never really seen anything like this. We found this just a few weeks ago. This is a different version of artificial life that's modeling really the chemistry of it, right? We're interested in sort of the cognition and the evolutionary evolvability of things. This is a mechanistic model that tries to simulate physics and chemistry and reactions and things like that. And it's really beautiful. I've never seen anything quite like it in terms of, it's really because of the GPU. We can now simulate tens of thousands of these pieces.
It looks so biological.
It looks like biology. I mean, it activates the part of your brain that's like, I'm looking at something that's alive. This is the kind of stuff that would have made Botticelli blush, right? Oh, man, So here they see just like a collision of these particles, so it's really trying to simulate, you can imagine it almost looks like platelets and debris, cellular debris or something like that. Right? If you take a swab of your cheek or whatever, put it under a microscope, that's what it looks like. And so it can simulate all these currents, and it can simulate momentum and all this. And here you can see the physics entities, they're going to smash into each other and then break off and break apart. So it's trying to model the DNA at that level to see really what that stuff is doing. And so they've got, here's self-deploying machines and machines that have their own blueprint, just like we were talking about. So this is really the next layer of the von Neumann automaton, but they're mobile. This is very related and very practical from a nanotechnology point of view. This is how we're going to construct nanotechnology. We're going to create little entities like these things that just do one thing, like links spin in a circle or whatever, but it finds another thing that links in a circle that connects and it does all this stuff. And then at the larger scale, you'll see something that does something useful at the human level. But essentially, when we think about molecular printing, Star Trek, replicators, and stuff like that, it's going to have to use kind of computational matter like this, where the pieces themselves are doing something. So we've had a very progressive idea that we like. We were just talking about it the last couple of days. Putting this together, I was thinking about kind of the AGI and what would it mean to have artificial general intelligence. We should start thinking about the code itself as being alive. Right? It's not going to be collections of Python strings of English characters and letters and words that's going to, I don't think, bring us to AGI. I think it's going to be something closer to this, where the things that we call the computational primitives, the codes, are going to be more like ecosystems and like a petri dish, and we'll add a little bit of this, and a little bit of that, and a little bit of this. And then we will learn, not even in a controlling way, but in a negotiation way. I was watching a talk, and they were talking about in the ancient world, primitive people, they did not control the jungle. They negotiated with it. We're not going to control nature, we're going to negotiate with it.
So it's interesting because, to understand cognition, it doesn't really help to talk about how just a few neurons interact, but a way to do it might be to just implicitly accept a certain model of how the brain works that's highly modularized, that says that, for example, if you, maybe neural MIDI columns replicate the same algorithm over and over again in the neocortex. This is sort of like the Jeffrey Hawkins or Kurzweil. Right, and so if we can take these kinds of principles and apply them just to the level of a neural MIDI column,
and then let the columns emerge,
and see what happens. That might not be intractable by today's methodologies.
Right.
And I'm not sure about resources, but
the MIDI column don't know they're a MIDI column. They don't know what the other MIDI columns do and stuff like that. They're just their own little abstraction.
yeah, is there a way to do it, or maybe someone here is already doing it?
I think that's the kind of just stuff we exactly want to put together. I don't think anybody's really thinking about it. I don't think anyone's thought in terms of like an ecosystem of mini columns, let's just say like that, right? Whether they're stuck and glued in one place on the grid, or whether they can move around and talk to their neighbors.
Okay, I think that's like kind of similar to the Badger stuff. I know I say this all the time, but because it is that kind
collections of little agents that are all the same.
Homogeneous agents that are working on shared tasks. But the people at the AI they have this architecture called Badger, and that's exactly what this is. And it has some local structure in terms of who's communicating with who. It's happening at a local level, but it's also happening separately at a global level. So there is an overarching kind of global schematic that's happening as well. But I think they're using a tension-based transformer, not like something like this.
I like the idea of a uniform kind of like a substrate that the solution kind of emerges out of it. Right? You want to be able to get computation by the foot, by the pound. And if you need more, add more microphones. You need more, add more badge agents. You need more. That's totally good. Like a deli. You can get a quarter pound. You can get as much as you need. So I thought this was really interesting. This just came out a few weeks ago. Just to get the idea of that. There's another one.
I wonder if anybody's specifically done anything where they use the primitive agent in an A-like program as a neural mini-call.
I don't think anybody's done anything
To
like
see if you
that. I
get
don't think anyone's
something
mixing these two
right in
fields.
line.
That's why I think the awesome stuff
I think you can assume.
is to see this AI.
So that might be kind of intriguing. I knew what you say about Badger. We were talking about Badger before, that software system in your project. Yeah, I
Forgot.
yeah. Yeah.
There are, you know who's doing something similar to what you just said?
Cola?
You got Crosshouse, because when I interviewed for them, they're like, they were basically pitching to me the idea that they want, not this picture, but what you just showed. Like, they wanted this, but they want to see if they can learn it.
Sure, that's just it.
So that, I mean, that's the angle they're.
We're not the only people.
One of the things.
What are
I
the
want-
agents though, that they're operating on, the fundamental?
So, do you know, her last name Sorosa, she worked on Chromia with, Kim Stanley. Lisa Sorosa, yeah, she's like big in the A-Life community. Kim Stanley, they came up with Chromia, which was like a really big A-Life, project, that's long time ago, but they were coming up with like their own version of this, where it's not necessarily chemical reactions, but there's this same kind of like commodity structure where you have basic components, and these basic components, some of them are gonna end up being more valuable than others, right? So if in this, like carbon gets pretty, or whatever, like for us, like carbon's pretty valuable, H2O pretty valuable molecules. So those are going to be coveted in different ways by different organisms. So we should definitely like try to collaborate with this.
One of the things that
Yeah, you
we're
want
working
to
on,
leverage it.
we're working on in parallel, I was doing another workshop on it, is this other kind of tread machine I was telling you about. So a simplified computer model, and the way we're trying to set it up is so that we can have like 1,000 of them that interact, or 10,000 of them that interact.
Is this the Misha idea
The WISC is the single instruction computer.
that,
Yeah, we should get a lot of progress on it.
Uh-huh.
And to try to think about like each agent has a full computer, it's a full Turing machine. So each agent has like, it's universal.
Mhm.
And I like this idea of, Alan Kay talks about when we take a computer, we split it up right away into something less powerful than the computer. In the programming, you can make variables and loops and stuff. One of the things that a computer can do is simulate other computers. So really what we should do with the computer is simulate 10,000 computers. So we take one computer here, a big computer, we use that to simulate 10,000 mini computers. And then each one of those is like a little agent, which is universal and autonomous, and then we can have sort of a swarm of these agents trying to solve tasks together.
Or, probably from a technical level, each of these particles is a state machine with physical properties. There's no actual chemistry being simulated. There's simply the actions of the state machine
Yeah, I'm calling it.
plus the physics.
Yeah, it's not really.
The physics is a real physics engine.
Yeah.
It's an accurate physics engine.
Like they still part of mass and momentum and things like that.
This is okay.
But you can imagine putting in binding rules, like simple binding rules, and you could probably
That's
put
what
in,
the state machine is.
yeah, you could probably put in, simulate van der Waals forces and stuff like that.
Yes.
Where do we get all this kind of complexity? We still have so much inspiration. There's this really great documentary that Rachel found a while back called Tierra. What's it called? Tierra.
I think it's Tierra.
Tierra.
It might just be Tierra.
Tierra.
I don't
It's
know.
Tierra. Tierra's the hat.
It's by Tom Ray.
It's not right. And but what's really neat is they have these sort of this evolution is very early. It's from the 80s.
This is
I'll
it?
post
This
this.
is Tierra?
Yeah, this is it.
Oh, it looks so good in color.
I know, it's so cool. And so I found a website I'll send you. And,
it's called Tierra?
or Terra. Hang on, I have
Oh,
a link.
Terra,
Give me
I'm
one
sorry,
second.
like,
I can't hear names, so.
It's you.
But it's by Tom Ray, so.
R-A-W? Or, I'm sorry, R-E-Y?
R-A-Y,
R-A-Y, thank you.
like a.
Let me pull up my GitHub. Oh, why did that not work? Well, I know where the link is. It's on
I
it.
know.
That's what I just go to my YouTube and look up.
So we've made a repository for all the artificial life stuff.
Oh,
And I'll share this with everybody. And if you go, it's project. There it is. There. It's here. Okay.
Which
Yeah,
is
it's
like
here.
little crown.
geez.
It's the same word.
Okay, so it is a little crap.
Okay.
Traders are ticked off because I took all the tricks I learned on the Chicago board.
So it's a really great documentary. It's got Stephanie Forrest here. She's the developer, the creator of artificial immune systems, which is really cool. So that would be awesome.
Yeah.
She's at Santa Fe. So she developed AIS, artificial immune systems. And then here's sort of the genetic algorithm. They got this guy did like a Bond bill. It's kind of interesting. And it's so here's a computer program, and they show the evolution of this thing and sort of how it works. And, it's very much in the style of the Neumann experiments from the 50s. Just trying to see sort of what binary patterns can self-replicate. But it's really interesting. They get these patterns, and there was sort of a minimum pattern that they needed. But then they found an instruction that was smaller than what they thought was required, and it was copying itself. And it was a parasite that was using the copying instructions from another organism so that it could have a smaller genome. Now think about it. You will evolve fast, but the smaller your genome, the faster you can evolve, right? So you're bootstrapping this task to some other, other agent that has that ability. So we can think about evolutionary pressures. I just saw there was a koi in Japan that sold for $1 billion because they wanted that particular pattern.
This actual fish.
An actual fish. It's one single koi fish. That there's these prized patterns that are rare and cultivated, and they're collectibles.
It's like a breed of dog or something.
Yeah, but extraordinarily rare.
Having this another patterns across the.
What's that?
Like for a given.
Well, that's what they genetically test. Animal husbandry, they do that.
I'm just wondering how precise it can be.
Oh, very. These are just random. These are random koi I had a picture of, but they have all kinds of different ones, right? So if you look up prized koi, we'll look it up.
Now look at it.
Yeah, look up my prized koi. There's about 5 or 6 different.
It's like a resolution.
But like dog breeds, there's like koi that people are like, I need to have one of those.
And
And-
it's been a very long time. They can
Like,
They live their owners.
Yeah.
Bottom line is, it's like, it has value, because you can say, you were able to afford that, so it's Gucci, it's just the same thing.
It turns out, I have them in my pond. It turns out they're the same thing as the 10-cent feeder goldfish. So if you want to save some goldfish, you can just get your own one by letting the goldfish get bigger. Okay, so I thought we could then, maybe go back to the whiteboard now and think about for a second, all right, what are we going to do with all this stuff? I've got a little bit more I want to show, but I thought we could then go back to the whiteboard in a second. The artist I'm showing here is Sid Mead. I don't know if anybody's heard of he's a digital artist. Now we've seen a little bit more about digital life. I think we've seen about some of the stuff we want to do. Is there anything more refined on our work around this?
I think it's interesting to think about, because we're always thinking about learning. And so one of the things I was interested in when you said, what if our code is alive? The first thing I thought about was not learning, right? I think it's interesting to think about an artificial life or a life that maybe doesn't learn.
There's two scales. I like this break out. There's 2 scales of learning.
But maybe it's creative. Maybe it has some other property that's very.
Well, what do we define as life? Let's start with that. So what's a useful
Like
definition that would?
jellyfish, I don't find them particularly useful.
They probably don't learn,
Great
right?
little
They
creatures.
probably don't learn. Maybe they learn.
Well, I think there's an interesting way to think about learning is that all learning happens on one of 2 time scales. Either at the time scale of the individual, like what we think of as learning, or the time scale of the species itself, which is what we think of as evolution. But it's really just learning. There's just 2 different algorithms that happen on 2 different time scales.
So is there evolution, what's their evolution early on without learning, right? Without any learning, no adaptation whatsoever, no even, it doesn't do anything, no cognition, doesn't do anything, it's just replicates.
Or like creativity, like how do we get does creativity need learning? I don't see any big arguments for that.
Creativity.
I mean, you can make arguments, I'm sure, I haven't.
What counts as creativity? That seems like a harder.
There's quite a few big arguments that creativity doesn't need learning,
Counts
actually.
as intelligence, so it seems to me.
Okay, great. No, so I'll just say replication, that we can define. So maybe I'm gonna make my life, definition of life.
Replication's tough though, because
Self-replication.
think of virus, is it still self-replication? It has to.
That's right.
Yeah.
So viruses and fuzzy, it's fuzzy.
Well, a lot of biologists say no, a lot of biologists say no.
It's just semantics, right? It's just
That's semantics.
But by the way, just
It's awesome.
computer viruses, they replicate.
Who's really alive? Me or my DNA?
But that's the thing,
Am I just dividing? I was thinking about the other day, right? We're just kind of the bouncer that protects your DNA, right?
What? Sorry?
You're just the bouncer that protects your DNA.
Well, you don't have to have a line of goals.
Right?
You don't have to have a line of goals.
I actually had a series.
Our DNA is not, our goals with our DNA not necessarily that.
I actually had a series we did with some biologists back in when I was in biology lab. And I said that we are not a single organism, we are just a symbiosis of a collection of different organisms.
So it's
So are we a symbiosis of different mentalities, right? Now it gets even weird. Right? Are we a symbiosis of different minds? Right? We're certainly, I think, modern biology would say we definitely are symbiosis, right? If we don't have our flora and all, we die very quickly.
And they will argue that, well, the cells can't replicate. And I said that, well, that's a definition, but if we give it enough, neurotrophic factors, other growth stimulants, it's going to self-replicate. We cannot self-replicate in women. So we need the environment.
So much of our immune system and possibly even our brain is actually wired up by these sort of helpers, right?
Exactly.
Bacteria are train our immune systems, and so they're probably involved in our brain development as well.
Yeah, they are. They actually specify a lot of your tastes, interests, and even personality. Like a lot of papers that came out, like
the one will change your personality.
yeah,
It will change depression. People change they've been severely depressed, but nothing is changing, and then they'll change their gut biome.
How do you change your gut biome?
There's a couple different ways they can do it. They basically transplant live. Yeah, they transplant. You could, but it's work.
There's so much research on that.
It's amazing. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
I got a few more slides I want to cover.
Living idea.
Are we gonna have I'm not trying to rush you, or maybe we should.
We're almost done. Yeah, we're almost done. We're gonna wrap that.
So we should take a little break.
Oh, I know. I'll tell you. Between which?
I can wait between that crowd.
Oh, yeah.
So you take as long as you want.
Okay, no, I'm almost done. Okay, so here we have just some of the little FARs. So now I'm going to kind of get into practically what I really want to do. I want to use these 2D game environments to create little FARs. It helps my brain to constrain what these AI tasks can do. That's why I kind of like the AI life kind of approach, because I know what squirrels do, I know what frogs do, I know what birds do. I don't have to scratch my head and be like, well, what is our abstract agent's goal and all that? Just like, we can simulate, we can use the constraints of real animals, and I think that just helps my brain think in concrete terms. And so what's amazing, we can get all this little free art, we create all these little awesome worlds, and we can put paths and goals and homes and things. So there's all these little animations that we can get. So we can get little fox, we can get little bunnies. We can put interfaces too. So I want to have a nicer way to actually see what's happening. We're talking about virtual EEG and virtual MRI. I want to see the neurons in our simulated animals as they bounce around the world. How they're actually making their decisions. And then we can give them goals and have them explore and bump into kind of stuff. So there's all these little fun assets that we can use. We'll make an Astro Chicken next time. But we can just grab all these. But it helps to think about, what are we really trying to simulate? If we can't do it with pixels, then how are we going to do it with a von Neumann probe or something? So I think it will allow us to tackle some of these early experiments. So I found a collection of these little characters that we can have. So if we want to make them more like cognitive agents, we can give them emotional states. You can turn these into chatbots, and there's no limit to how intelligent this little abstract character can be behind it, and now we can have a lot of them learn to interact. She's carrying a corn and so on. So we can give them a goal. We think about the emergence of agriculture itself. It's an extraordinary kind of leap from hunter-gatherer. Could we simulate that kind of transition? I think that's a really wacky kind of.
Just to be clear, in the code, really you just add on, now run the brain on the inputs.
Oh, absolutely.
The brain could be something.
The brain can run on one of these giant machines that's taking in, it can see the little world around it, maybe it can see, it knows it's talking to this person, it can see the emotional state of that person and so on. We can think creatively about it, and else move these things forward. So build the gardens.
So you want the stuff in that world to be able to learn, right?
Exactly.
You're not putting just a bunch of
Yeah, we're not trying to make a little video game. We're trying to make them as smart as possible. Does this little piggy, does it learn, we could give that a thirst meter and a hunger meter. And it has to bump into the water. When it does, it can relieve its thirst. It has to bump into the hay to fill it. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, it dies, and we make another generation of them. And to think about, what can we actually get, kind of behaviors can we evolve. And it just helps my brain to make it concrete. Rather than saying I have some vector that got larger, I can be like, my piglet is not doing good. I can use other areas of my brain than we have.
For people who weren't here the last couple of weeks, where we were talking about why not just use other people's code that has, it's really important to point out if you haven't heard before. So the idea is that you're going to be inside that little girl, her eyes, you see. The agent is going to look, the brain is going to live inside her eye, inside her brain. And she's going to see whatever that little girl would see.
So we can imagine that little girl.
It's very good at that thing that's hard.
So she's right there, that's her eyes, right? so there's our little person, and it's standing there, in this big forest, kind of a thing. And maybe there's a prize over here, right? There's some apple or something that you can eat that's up there, but it can't see that. So we're gonna put a little bubble, a perceptual bubble around it, which we haven't seen anyone else do, to say you can see this area. Maybe a little bit around, maybe even just the front, so you have to turn around, right? And so you can give it that little bit of the screen and say, what would you like to do? Would you like to go left? Would you like to go right? Would you like to go forward? Would you like to talk? You know, who's there? And so on. So you can have all these different actions that this little character is going to be trying to do, and it doesn't know when to do them. And so we're going to try to put an evolutionary-driven neural network behind it so that it can learn to walk around, to explore, to consume the rewards, to avoid the pitfalls, and so on. And then see what's the minimal, kind of like how Neumann was saying, what's the simplest model we can put in these little characters for the pig, for example. Like what's the simplest little model we can put in there such that it gets its food, it gets its water, and all that. And then build up the complexity as we go. And think, well, what does the farmer need? How much more sophisticated does the farmer need to be than the pig to run out or whatever? And so the idea is that you guys can think creatively about the character art sets. There's a lot of different art sets. It doesn't have to be this aesthetic or whatever. It's just an example.
I would love to see this is so off topic. I would love to see the experiment where we have like a fully developed pig brain and a fully developed farmer brain, and we just switch their bodies and see who's going to control who at that point. Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Then you can start to see if the pigs are.
Have you seen The Island of Dr. Untitled?
I have, yeah. Well, there's also this sci-fi series by David Brin on uplifting animals.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I already know what it means, so I just
It's
feel like I just could.
really interesting. I mean, if you uplift, like if you add an enhancement to, say, a pig, what would you end up with, and how would it relate to the kind of,
Just kind of areas.
you know, yeah, and their animates, you know, creatures that are part computational and part biological.
What are you doing this?
Animats?
Animal what?
Animat. So
You
the,
see
like,
the brain boys in cartoon now?
there's a really colorful one, actually, it was done at the University of Florida, where they cultured the cells from a cortex of a rat and then hooked it up to a deep learning system and taught the system as a whole to navigate, to pilot their routines in, it's crazy.
What's the animal research about that? I didn't have the heart to put in here.
They're just cells from the cortex of a rat. Now, is it emergent consciousness? Is it? I mean, that's philosophical.
Well, what about the farmers?
They're no longer in the brain, but then if you put them into a larger, if you embed the biology into a larger, say, deep learning system, is the system as a whole something that could be cognitive, yes, by the simple definition of cognitive.
We don't think animal cruelty laws apply to our virtual pig, right? I don't think we have to address those in this decade.
Yeah.
You're going to hear soon.
So it becomes pretty messy with these really expansive definitions of life, right? So, you know, if people are willing to say that artificial life or artificial intelligence satisfies the definition of life, is, I think, not, I mean, many seem to be.
Well, then we're going to think about things like the bug spray. Let's worry about it, right?
I agree. It comes to
Most people have that.
But think about what that means.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
this is the primary, or whether it's like.
But think about, you know,
This is the primary.
think about things like the test control.
A lot of people, it's definitely trying to stay on.
What do you mean?
Yeah, well, we're definitely biologically inclined to that. You know, cute and fluffy, I call it cute and fluffy fallacy.
Well, then, you know, we have to think
And
about,
then AI developers are gonna make all kinds of, they're gonna take advantage of that. Yeah.
because we have another extreme right now with pest control. So what do we think about,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
what do you think about the entire industry of, you know, termite and ant and cockroach poison and all that, right? These are entire industries, right? Meta organism on this planet, his entire purpose is to just destroy another class of life form, right?
Oh, it's
So it's really kind of frightening in a sense. I worry about these things because, you know, ants are probably not that bad for you. ant poison probably is really bad for you, right? And so we just don't have the level of science for people to realize that we're made up out of trillions of little organisms. So we have things like pest killers and preservatives and antibiotics and all that. We're killing our own self. We just don't have a rich enough model of what our self actually is. All right, so I just want to end with some open questions I found on the wiki. So I thought this was neat. They have these nice open questions here that we can look at. In particular, this last one here. We've got some really great stuff. So I think we can all take some of these questions and try to explore some of these ideas. So that's what I had for today. I want to thank you for joining us on our first. So Friday, I'd like to follow in the same theme and do a little bit of hands-on. I'd like you to, we're going to get a little pig animated, we'll get a little chicken animated, we'll get a little backdrop, maybe we'll make a random planet, and then I have some code that have a fish.
Right now, at this point.
Yeah, bring your laptop, try to set some stuff up on here. Some of the stuff's on Pygame, so it's a little hard to run remotely. Some of the stuff we can run on CodeLab. So we'll just kind of have a fun, interactive session, and we'll get to just kind of try some of these ideas.
We gotta get the new code. This is such.
I know, that's a couple years ago, but it's the biggest, it's the one we have at everybody, so we need another.
Yeah, that is.
I know a whole bunch of them.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, Ruben's even, is that Ruben? No, that's.
No, it is.
Russ behind me.
No, Ruben's right here.
I'm gonna send Ruben a picture, so he knows how much fun we're already having.
Please.